when the Quran was revealed, and we see it as Muslims, we see it as the last testament. It comes as a final testament from Allah, the last dispensation for humanity, and that in our understanding, in our tradition, it abrogates the previous ones. It doesn't negate the truths that are in them, but it says that this is the final testament for humanity. And then it calls everybody to it, allowing them the option to stay outside of it. Because it's a nonlinear book, for many people, especially Western people, when they go into it, they find it very confusing. And we find this in Carlyle's, when he did Heroes and Hero Worship in Victorian England. He chose as a hero the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, which was scandalous at the time because he didn't choose Jesus, for instance. But in there, he talks about how difficult it was for him to read the Quran. And he said, if this is this remarkable book, where do we put the Iliad or the Odyssey? In other words, it doesn't follow any patterns. Well, that's, I think, partly a testimony to the truth of the Quran, that it is not like any other book. Because it is uniquely amongst the revealed books, it is the one that is directly from God. So even Jews and Christians understand that the Bible and the New Testament are inspired works. So they're inspired by God. So there's a wahi, but it's human beings that it's transmitted through them. That's why they find discrepancies and other things in them that don't really bother them from that perspective, because they understand that the scribes can make mistakes and things like that. So they don't have the same understanding that we have, whereas the Quran itself comes directly from God to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet is merely a conduit for this revelation. So it's coming through him to us. And so if we define the Quran according to the usuli scholars, and there's two types of usul in our tradition. There's usul al-din and usul al-fiqh. Usul al-din is related to aqidah or creed, or what we believe. And in our tradition, the Quran, in the Sunni tradition, the Quran is madlul al-lafzi al-qa'imi bi dhatillah. So it's the madlul, in other words, it's the indications of this that the utterances convey, that is eternal with Allah. So that is a very difficult part of kalam, or the tradition of dialectical theology, that I'm not going to go into. So that's one way to interpret it. But the way the fuqaha interpret it, and this is from Sidi Abdullah wal Hajj Ibrahim, one of the great Mauritanian usuli scholars, he said he said that the Quran was lafdhun munazzarun ala Muhammadi li ajl al-i'jazi wal ta'abbudi. So that's the definition in fiqh of the Quran. It is an utterance that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in order to incapacitate creation. In other words, as a miraculous book that could not be replicated, and as a means of devotion, ta'abbud. Now, one of the interesting things about ta'abbud is that the word in Arabic to recite the Quran, which is how we do devotion with the Quran, is tilawa. Like yatruna kitabullahi, right? Those who recite the book, right? Tilawa is we recite the book, and then haqqa tilawatihi, they do it with its due. And so for the mujawwid, the person who's doing tajweed, that means like to give i'ta'u kulli harfin haqqahu wa mustahaqqahu, like they'll say, to give every letter its due, and then it's circumstantial due. So like idgham is a circumstantial due, not every situation. The wow, you have idgham in the letters of idgham, assimilation, like yarmalun. So for the mujawwid, that's what that means. But for the faqih, tilawa also means to follow. So it means to recite, but it also means to follow, or to do what the Quran is telling you to do. وَالْقَمْرِ إِذَا تَلَاهَا. So the moon when it follows the sun. So tilawa means to recite and to follow. So when you yatruna kitabullahi haqq tilawati, when you're reciting the book of Allah as it should be recited, it means you're also following it. So it's not just simply following it, but reciting it, but it's following. So you're reciting it with your tongue, you're believing it in your heart, and you're acting according to it with your arkan, right? So it's tilawatun ala lisan, i'tiqadun fil jinan, wal amalun bil arkan. So this is how the book of Allah. Now, because it's a non-linear book, and I'll just give you one example of something very fascinating about the Quran. The Jews have a lot of stories in their book. It's a very, in fact, the Bible is read as literature now. There are many people that will read the Bible as literature, not even believing that it's a revelation, but it's a fascinating book with great stories. The Quran, when some of the Sahaba came and complained about not having stories like the Jews have stories, the 12th surah in the Quran, Yusuf, is revealed. Yusuf is like a biblical story. It's a completely intact narrative in the Quran. It's the only chapter in the entire Quran that is similar. And it's as if, to me, it's as if God was saying, I can do that. Like I can do a book like that. I've already done that. But this is different. Like this book is different. So the extraordinary aspect of the Quran to me is that there is a verse in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا أقسم بمواقع النجوم وإنه لقسم لو تعلمون عظيم إنه لقرآن كريم. That I swear by the mawaqi' an-nujum. This is in Surah Al-Waqi'ah. I swear by the positions of the stars. And this is a vast oath if you but knew. And this is a generous Quran. When I lived in the Sahara Desert, I used to go every night, would look up in the sky, and it had the most clear skies in the world because there's no light pollution. And you could, the number of stars that you could see was just astronomical. And it was so extraordinary to look up at the night sky. But if you don't know anything about the stars, it just looks like a jumble of lights up in the heavens, and it doesn't look like there's any order. They just look like. But there was a man there that I lived with who used to teach me the stars. So he'd show me at night. He'd say, "This is, Thuraya, and this is Al-Jabbar, and this is Al-Jathi," and he would show me, and then he would say, "This one emerges on this date on the horizon, and this one on this date, and this one indicates this season." He had a complete knowledge of the night sky. And over time, I got to understand the night sky in a completely different way, because most people grow up in environments where there's no stars anymore. They might see a few stars, but they don't see stars anymore. The Quran is like that. If you look at it the way Thomas Carlyle looked at it, it's just a jumble of lights. Astaghfirullah for even saying that. But that's what it appears to be to people. It appears as if it's just a jumble of these amazing, lights that are flashing without any cohesion. But if you have the time, the patience, and the wherewithal to study the book, you will begin to see these incredibly deep patterns in the book. So it's very much the opposite of in the Western tradition, where books have an outward cohesion, but as you begin to study them deeper, they often fall apart. This is what deconstruction is all about. And the Quran is the opposite. Outwardly, it looks like it doesn't have a cohesion, but as the deeper you study it, the more clear the order comes. And one of the things about the repetition in the Quran is that there is no repetition in the Quran. I mean, this idea that I'll get into that. I'm going to deal with that on one of these sessions. The Quran, when it does use the same stories, very often you will see either it's embedded in a very different sequence for a purpose, and then you will see just changes in the words that are very subtle because of the sequence that it's in. And this is why traditionally our scholars understood that the miracle of the Quran is not a scientific miracle. There's some interesting scientific facts in the Quran, that's fine, but it is not the miracle of the Quran. The miracle of the Quran is rhetorical. It is a miracle of language. And we're in a civilization that privileges science over, and by that I mean the material sciences, over other aspects. But the single most interesting thing about our species is not science, it's language. We are creatures of language, and this is what makes us unique. And the Quran is ultimately a linguistic miracle. It's a miracle of language, and language is what separates us from the rest of creation. All creation has certain types of languages and codes and everything, but we are uniquely this species that is endowed with the gift of the logos, of reason, and language by its very nature is reasonable. It is logical. And that's why it has a grammar, it has a deep structure. And that grammar can only be understood by studying it. And the same is true for the Quran.